The soft hum of the vacuum cleaner echoed through the empty office hallways, accompanied by the shuffle of worn-out sneakers against polished floors. Lily Carter pushed her cleaning cart slowly, her tired hands gripping the handle as she moved from room to room. It was well past midnight, the hour when the building's high-powered executives had long since left for their luxurious homes. For Lily, however, this was just another late shift in an endless cycle of work and survival. Pausing for a moment, Lily leaned against the cart, her reflection catching her eye in the glass wall beside her. The fluorescent lights illuminated her worn features, the shadows under her hazel eyes, the stray blonde strands escaping her ponytail, and the oversized uniform that hung loosely on her slim frame. Despite her exhaustion, there was a quiet determination in her gaze, a spark of resilience that refused to be extinguished. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. Fishing it out with one hand, Lily smiled faintly at the picture of her 5-year-old son, Jake, that lit up the screen. A message from her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Turner, reassured her that Jake had eaten well and was now fast asleep. "Thank you," Lily typed back quickly, her heart swelling with gratitude. Jake was her world, the reason she pushed through the judgmental stares and whispered remarks from her coworkers. His laughter was her solace after exhausting days, and his boundless curiosity reminded her that life still held joy, even in its darkest moments. As Lily tucked her phone away and resumed her cleaning, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She didn't know how or when, but the storm brewing just beyond her control was about to upend everything she thought she knew about her life. Lily Carter's routine was broken the following morning when she entered the office, only to feel the weight of suspicious stares following her every step. The usual whispers were louder, sharper, carrying an edge that made her skin prickle. She tried to brush it off, focusing on her tasks, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Mid-morning, 2 security guards approached her in the break room. "Ms. Carter, please come with us," one said, his tone cold and professional. Lily's stomach churned. "Is something wrong?" she asked cautiously. "You'll find out soon enough," the guard replied, motioning her to follow. They led her to the top floor where David Morgan's office loomed like a fortress of glass and steel. The grandeur of the space felt oppressive, and Lily's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she stepped inside. David sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her. His presence was commanding, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Carter," he began, his tone clipped. "A valuable item has gone missing from the company's safe. A necklace, to be specific. One of great sentimental and monetary value." Lily blinked, confusion washing over her. "I don't understand. What does that have to do with me?" David leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "We have reason to believe you're involved." The accusation hit her like a blow. "What? I would never—" "Spare me the denials," he interrupted, his voice firm. "The evidence is circumstantial but damning. You were seen near the safe area shortly before the item disappeared." Lily's mind raced. She had cleaned the executive floor as always, but hadn't gone near the safe. The implication that she had stolen something was both infuriating and terrifying. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice trembling. "I was just doing my job." David studied her for a moment, his gaze cold, but with a flicker of something undecipherable. "You're a single mother, aren't you? Times must be hard for you. But stealing? That's a line you shouldn't have crossed." Lily's cheeks burned with anger. "I'm not a thief," she said firmly. Lily's breath quickened as David fixed his cold gaze on her. "You were seen near the safe area shortly before the necklace went missing," he said. "I don't understand. There must be a mistake." Lily pleaded, her voice shaking. "Please, check the cameras. I was cleaning the hallways just like every night." A low murmur from the HR manager standing in the corner interrupted. "Mr. Morgan, this incident has already reached the ears of some board members. They are expecting swift action." David hesitated for a brief moment, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just about what you say, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone icy. "It's about the company's reputation. We can't afford to wait." "Regardless," David said, his tone unyielding, "this company cannot tolerate even the appearance of impropriety. You're dismissed, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Lily felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't do this. I need this job." "My son, I suggest you collect your things and leave quietly," David said, cutting her off. "There's no point in dragging this out." Tears stung Lily's eyes as she turned and left the office, the weight of the accusation pressing down on her like a boulder. Lily stood in the janitorial closet, her hands trembling as she stuffed her belongings into a small bag. Her dismissal had been swift and merciless, leaving her reeling with anger and humiliation. She glanced at the amulet around her neck, a small golden pendant shaped like a crescent moon. It had always been her source of comfort, a keepsake left behind by her mother, Laura, before she disappeared years ago. As she bent down to pick up her belongings, the chain of the amulet snapped, and it clinked softly as it fell to the floor. With a frustrated sigh, Lily crouched to retrieve it, but before she could, a shadow loomed over her. David Morgan was standing there, his imposing figure filling the doorway. His usual stern expression faltered as his sharp blue eyes fixated on the fallen amulet. He knelt and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice suddenly low and unsteady. Lily frowned, confused by the shift in his tone. "It was my mother's," she said cautiously. "She gave it to me before she disappeared." David's hand trembled slightly as he inspected the intricate details of the pendant. His expression shifted from irritation to shock, and then to something Lily couldn't quite place. Disbelief, perhaps? Or even fear. "This is impossible," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "What's impossible?" Lily asked, standing to face him. David looked up at her, his face pale. "This amulet. It's identical to one I gave to my wife, Laura. It was custom made. There's no other like it." Lily's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as the revelation struck her like a thunderclap. "This doesn't make sense," she stammered, her voice trembling. David stared at her, the weight of realization sinking in. "We need to talk," he said finally. "Not here, not now, but soon." He handed the amulet back to her, his hand lingering for a moment before he walked away, leaving Lily frozen in place. Her mind raced with questions she didn't know how to answer. How could her mother's amulet be connected to David Morgan? And what did this mean for her? Lily sat at the small kitchen table in her cramped apartment, the amulet resting in her palm. She had spent hours staring at it, trying to piece together the significance of David Morgan's reaction. His words echoed in her mind. "It's identical to one I gave to my wife, Laura." Her mother's name was Laura. The thought made her chest tighten. Could it really be possible? Could David Morgan, the man who had fired her without a second thought, be connected to her mother? And to her? The knock on the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. She opened it to find David standing there, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "May I come in?" he asked. Lily hesitated, but stepped aside, allowing him to enter. David's presence felt out of place in her modest home, his tailored suit contrasting sharply with the worn furniture and peeling wallpaper. "Why are you here?" she asked, crossing her arms defensively. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the table toward her. Lily picked it up, her breath catching. The woman in the photo was unmistakably her mother. Her warm smile and gentle eyes were etched in Lily's memory. Around her neck was the same amulet that now rested in Lily's palm. "This is my wife, Laura," David said quietly, his voice softened as he spoke her name. "She wore that amulet every day. It was custom made for her. There's no doubt in my mind that she was your mother." Lily's hands trembled as she placed the photo back on the table. "That can't be," she whispered. "If she was your wife, then what does that make you?" David's expression was pained as he looked at her. "It makes me your father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room spun as Lily clutched the edge of the table. Her father? The man who had dismissed her without a second thought? Memories of her childhood flashed before her, the countless nights staring at the ceiling in the orphanage, wondering why she wasn't good enough to be loved. "You're saying you're my father?" she whispered, her voice brittle. "Where were you when I cried myself to sleep? When I needed someone to tell me I wasn't alone?" David's face crumpled with guilt, but Lily barely noticed. Anger swelled in her chest, mixing with the grief she had buried for years. "You had a family, a life, and I was nothing. Just some kid nobody wanted." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't know if I can forgive you for that." The words hit Lily like a tidal wave. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind struggling to process the revelation. "No," she said, shaking her head. "It doesn't make sense. She would have told me. She wouldn't have just left me." "I don't know why she kept this from me," David admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "After she disappeared, I was told our child, my child, had been sent to an orphanage. I tried to find you, but it was as if you'd vanished." Lily's eyes filled with tears, anger and grief warring within her. "You're saying you're my father, but where were you when I needed you? When I was alone, wondering why no one wanted me?" David's face crumpled with guilt. "I failed you," he said simply. "I should have tried harder, but I swear to you, Lily, I didn't know. If I had..." His voice broke, and for the first time, Lily saw a vulnerability in him that made her pause. She looked down at the amulet, its delicate crescent moon glinting in the dim light. It had always been her connection to her mother, a piece of her past that gave her strength. Now it was a link to something she had never imagined, a father she never knew she had. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, her voice trembling. David nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand, but I want to try. I want to be part of your life and Jake's, if you'll let me." Lily stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. The anger in her chest hadn't subsided, but beneath it, there was something else. A fragile hope, a longing she had buried long ago. "We'll see," she said cautiously. "But don't expect it to be easy." David managed a faint smile. "I wouldn't expect anything less." David Morgan sat at the small dining table in Lily's apartment. His sharp, commanding demeanor softened as he helped Jake with his math homework. Jake's brow furrowed as he stared at the page, his tiny fingers gripping a pencil tightly. "Think of it like this," David said, gently, pointing to a problem on the worksheet. "If you have 3 apples and I give you 2 more, how many do you have?" Jake's eyes lit up. 5, he exclaimed, scribbling the answer excitedly. "Exactly," David said, smiling. "You're a fast learner." Lily watched the scene from the kitchen, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. It was surreal seeing her son interact so naturally with a man she barely trusted. And yet, Jake's laughter echoed through the small apartment, a sound that tugged at her heart. Over the following weeks, David became a regular visitor. He would stop by after work, bringing small gifts for Jake, a new book, a puzzle, or a set of crayons. Jake adored him, running to the door each time David arrived with an enthusiastic, "Grandpa!" Despite Jake's growing bond with David, Lily found it harder to let her guard down. She couldn't forget the harshness of their first encounter or the years of absence that left her feeling unwanted. But David was persistent, showing up consistently and making an effort to connect not just with Jake, but with her as well. One Saturday afternoon, David invited them to the park. "There's a science fair," he explained, holding up a flyer. "I thought Jake might enjoy it." Jake's face lit up. "Can we go, Mommy, please?" Lily hesitated, but the excitement in Jake's eyes made her relent. "All right," she said. At the park, Jake darted from booth to booth, his energy infectious. When he reached a rocket launch demonstration, his eyes widened in awe as a miniature rocket soared into the clear blue sky, leaving a trail of smoke behind. "They would love to do that too. Did you see that, Grandpa?" Jake exclaimed, tugging on David's hand. "I sure did," David replied, crouching to Jake's level. "You know, I used to build rockets like that when I was your age. Maybe we can build one together sometime." "Really?" Jake's eyes widened. "Really," David said, smiling. Lily watched from a distance, the scene both heartwarming and unsettling. She couldn't deny the genuine joy Jake felt in David's presence, but opening her heart to the man who had once judged her so harshly felt like stepping onto unsteady ground. That evening, after Jake had fallen asleep, David stayed a little longer, sitting across from Lily at the small kitchen table. "You've done an amazing job raising him," David said, breaking the silence. "He's smart, kind, and curious. That's all because of you." Lily looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her shirt. "I've just done what I had to," she said. David shook his head. "You've done more than that, and I want to help, if you'll let me." Lily met his gaze, her defenses cracking just a little. "It's not easy for me to trust," she admitted. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight," David said. "But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Lily nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll see." The sun filtered through the thin curtains in Lily's apartment as she sat at the kitchen table, the amulet resting in her palm. Its crescent moon design shimmered faintly in the light, a silent reminder of her mother's absence and the mystery surrounding her past. Across from her, David sat with a folder in his hands, his expression thoughtful but hesitant. "I've been looking into Laura's life before she disappeared," David said, placing the folder on the table. "I think we might find answers in the town where she grew up." Lily's heart raced as she opened the folder. Inside were old photographs, addresses, and the name of someone who might know more. Margaret Hayes, her mother's childhood friend. "Do you think she'll talk to us?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. David nodded. "She might. Margaret was close to Laura. If anyone knows what happened during those final years, it's her." The next morning, Lily and David set out for the small town where Laura had spent her childhood. Jake, clutching his favorite toy rocket, hummed happily in the back seat, oblivious to the weight of the journey. The drive was quiet, filled with the unspoken anticipation of what they might uncover. When they arrived, Margaret Hayes welcomed them warmly into her modest home. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her kind eyes studied Lily with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. "You have her eyes," Margaret said softly, gesturing for them to sit. As they settled into the cozy living room, surrounded by shelves of books and framed photographs, Margaret began to speak. "Laura was always full of life," Margaret said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "But she carried a lot of pain too. She never talked about it directly, but I could see it in her." "What kind of pain?" Lily asked, leaning forward. Margaret hesitated, her expression clouding. "She felt trapped," she said finally. "She loved deeply, but she was torn between what she wanted and what she thought was right. She always worried she wasn't enough." Margaret sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Laura always wanted to shield you from the world she felt trapped in," she began. "When she married David, she thought she was stepping into a dream. But over time, the expectations of high society, the constant judgment, the coldness, it wore her down." Lily leaned forward, her breath caught. "Did they fight?" "Not at first," Margaret said gently. "But when you were born, Laura wanted to leave that life behind. She begged David to move somewhere simpler, to raise you without the weight of their world. But he couldn't see it. He thought she was being ungrateful." Margaret's voice broke slightly. "She left because she thought she could give you a better life on her own. But she was wrong. She underestimated how hard it would be, and in trying to protect you, she only created more pain." Lily's throat tightened. Did she ever mention me?" Margaret's gaze softened. "She did. She loved you more than anything, Lily. But she was scared. She thought she'd failed you. That's why she left, to figure out how to be the mother she believed you deserved." Tears welled in Lily's eyes as Margaret reached for her hand. "She didn't fail me," Lily whispered, her voice breaking. Margaret smiled gently. "I think she knew that deep down, but sometimes fear makes us do things we can't take back." David, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Do you know why she didn't tell me about Lily?" Margaret shook her head. "She never shared everything. I think she was trying to protect both of you in her own way." As they left Margaret's house, Lily felt a mixture of grief and clarity. Her mother's choices had hurt her deeply, but they were born out of love and fear, not malice. During the drive back, Lily clutched the amulet tightly, her mind swirling with thoughts. She glanced at David, who was focused on the road, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said softly. David turned to her, his eyes filled with sincerity. "You deserve to know the truth, Lily. And I'll help you find it, no matter what." That evening, after tucking Jake into bed, Lily sat alone in the living room with the box of her mother's belongings. Among the photographs and trinkets was a letter Margaret had given her, a note Laura had written but never sent. Lily unfolded the paper carefully, her hands trembling. "My dearest Lily, by the time you read this, I hope you'll understand the choices I made were not out of a lack of love, but because I loved you more than I thought possible. I wanted to be the mother you deserved, strong, unwavering, but I failed. The world I left behind was suffocating, and I thought running away would free us both. Instead, it left us shattered. I carried the weight of leaving every single day, every smile you gave me, every tear you shed. It reminded me of the life I was trying to build for us, and the one I had taken away from you. I don't know if I was right, but I tried, Lily. I tried to make a home for us in the only way I knew how. If nothing else, know this. You were my light, my reason for living. I hope one day you can forgive me and find the happiness I always wanted for you." Lily clutched the letter to her chest as tears streamed down her face. The words were a gift, a piece of her mother's heart that she had longed to find. The next day, she shared the letter with David. They sat together on the couch, the quiet hum of Jake's cartoons in the background. "She loved you so much," David said, his voice thick with emotion. Lily nodded, her fingers tracing the delicate handwriting. "And now I know she wanted me to have a family. She wanted me to feel loved." David placed a hand over hers, his gaze steady. "You do have a family, Lily. You have me and Jake. And together, we can honor her memory." For the first time in years, Lily felt a sense of peace, a tentative but real hope that the past could be a bridge to a better future. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as Lily sat beside David, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jake sat on her other side, his legs swinging beneath the bench as he fidgeted with the buttons on his coat. "Mommy, what do I have to say to the judge?" Jake whispered, looking up at her with wide, curious eyes. Lily smiled softly, brushing a hand through his hair. "Just tell him how you feel, sweetheart. Be yourself." David leaned forward, his expression warm but serious. "You'll do great, Jake. Just speak from your heart." Jake nodded, his small chest puffed out with determination. When their case was called, Lily felt her breath catch in her throat. She followed the judge's directions, taking her seat beside David and Jake. The judge, a kind-faced man with graying hair, looked at them over his glasses. "This is the case of David Morgan's petition to adopt Jake Carter as his legal grandson," the judge announced. "Let's begin." David spoke first, his voice steady and filled with emotion. He explained his journey to reconnect with Lily and his growing bond with Jake. "I've come to love this boy as my own grandson," David said, glancing at Jake with a tender smile. "This adoption is about showing Jake that he is part of a family that will always be there for him." The judge nodded, turning his attention to Jake. "And what about you, young man? How do you feel about all this?" Jake tiptoed eagerly to the microphone, his face glowing with uncontainable excitement. "I love my grandpa," he declared, his voice ringing out with pure sincerity. "He's the best. He helps me with my homework and plays with me and makes me laugh. I want him to be my grandpa forever." The judge chuckled, his eyes crinkling at Jake's earnestness. "Well, that's quite an endorsement." Finally, the judge turned to Lily. "And you, Miss Carter, do you support this petition?" Lily took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I do. David has shown me, time and again, that he is committed to being a part of our lives. He loves Jake, and Jake loves him. This is the right decision for our family." The judge nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Very well. After reviewing the case and hearing from all parties, I am pleased to grant the petition for adoption. Congratulations, Mr. Morgan. You are now Jake Carter's legal grandfather." The sound of the gavel felt like a final punctuation mark on a chapter of their lives. Jake cheered, throwing his arms around David. "We did it, Grandpa!" David hugged him tightly, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, we did, buddy." Later that evening, they gathered at David's home for a celebration. A banner reading "Our Family Forever" hung across the dining room, and Jake proudly wore a paper badge that read "Official Grandson." As they sat down for dinner, David raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice strong but warm. "To new beginnings and the love that brought us here." "To family," Lily echoed, her voice soft but resolute. "Boo Grandpa!" Jake shouted, raising his glass of apple juice high. The room filled with laughter, a joyful sound that seemed to erase the years of pain and doubt that had preceded this moment. That night, as Lily tucked Jake into bed, he looked up at her sleepily. "Mommy, do you think Grandma would be happy?" Lily's throat tightened, and she kissed his forehead gently. "I think she'd be very happy, sweetheart. And I think she'd be proud of us." Jake smiled, his eyes drifting closed. In the quiet of the living room, Lily sat alone, the amulet resting in her hand. It no longer felt like a reminder of loss, but a bridge connecting her to her mother and the family she had now found. David's words echoed in her mind. "You do have a family, Lily. You have me and Jake." For the first time in years, she believed it. A sun streamed through the living room windows of David's house, casting a warm glow over the small gathering. Jake sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully piecing together a model rocket with David's guidance. "Make sure the fins are straight," David said, holding up a ruler to check the alignment. Jake nodded seriously, his tiny tongue poking out in concentration. "Like this?" "Perfect," David replied with a smile. "You're getting really good at this." Lily watched from the couch, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. The scene before her felt almost surreal, a life she had never dared to imagine. Seeing Jake so happy, working side by side with his grandfather, filled her with a warmth she hadn't known in years. "Mommy, we're almost done," Jake called, holding up the rocket proudly. "It looks amazing, sweetheart," Lily said, smiling. Over the months since the adoption, life had settled into a new, comforting rhythm. David had become a steady presence in their lives, not just as a grandfather to Jake, but as a source of support for Lily. Whether it was attending Jake's school events, helping him with his science projects, or simply sharing Sunday dinners, David showed up consistently, proving his commitment to their family.